Hello comrades, this is the Finnish Bolshevik. A lot of people have been asking me why I'm not a Maoist, or if I am a Maoist, or how I feel about Maoism, or marxism-leninism, Maoism, whatnot. Before I get into that, I wrote a blog post some time ago about my thoughts on Hoxhaism, which I'll put in the description, and I think in that blog post I said that I was gonna write a similar one about Maoism, which I haven't done yet. Probably will at some point, but because people were asking this so much in the comments of the last video, I thought I should just do a quick video explaining roughly my thoughts on Maoism. Am I a Maoist? Well, I consider myself to be a Marxist-Leninist. I don't consider myself to be a Maoist. Although, some time ago I did consider myself a Maoist, but not anymore. But I'm also not a Hoxhaist, and I don't really have much against Mao. And I can see why this would sort of lead to some confusion, but basically, I don't think that Maoism is necessary, because that's the thing that Maoists, they usually say. A lot of them say that Maoism is necessary, that it's a necessary improvement to Marxism-Leninism, it's a necessary development, a necessary addition to Marxism-Leninism or something. Or they will say, well, come on, you agree with Mao, you don't have any problem with Mao, you think all these things that Mao developed and said were okay and they were good, so might as well add Mao to your thing. Might as well be MLM instead of just ML. I know exactly what people are gonna say in response to this when I get into it, but first of all, I'm gonna acknowledge the difference between Maoism and Mao Zedong thought. Because basically, I agree with most of Mao Zedong thought. In my opinion, Mao was a great Marxist-Leninist. And generally, what Mao did, the stuff that he developed and he applied to the Chinese conditions, that is generally called Mao Zedong thought. That's what they called it at the time. When Mao was alive, they didn't talk about Maoism, they talked about Mao Zedong thought. Or Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Now, the term Maoism arose when all these other people started applying it as well. And I guess it would have been kind of weird if they had called it Mao Zedong thought as well, because basically, the Shining Path has a lot to do with this. Their leader was Gonzalo, so they called it Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, Gonzalo thought. You know, applying Mao's ideas to Peru, and, you know, doing their own thing in Peru. And Gonzalo was their theoretical and philosophical leader, so they called it Gonzalo thought. Similarly, in India and the Philippines and these other places, they've all applied Maoism, or, you know, Mao's ideas. So really, my thing with Maoism is that I don't so much disagree with Maoism, it's just that I think Maoism exaggerates certain things and I don't think Maoism is necessary. And I know that some people are gonna protest, and I know that this is like, maybe a controversial topic, but I'm just gonna say my thing, and then after that I'm gonna respond to the counter-argument which I know is gonna be made. So, what is Mao Zedong thought? What are the main ideas put forward by Mao Zedong thought? A lot of the big ideas. And I have talked about this before, but now I'm devoting a specific video to it. So, Mao Zedong thought, in my opinion, is basically Marxism-Leninism applied to the conditions of China, and a lot of those lessons can be applied in semi-feudal, semi-colonial countries in general, third world countries in general, not just China, but Mao applied them in his country, in China. So, what were those ideas? Well, there's People's War. People's War is basically the military strategy that they used. Like, you can argue if it's more than a military strategy, or if it's just a military strategy, but whatever. So what is People's War? People's War is the idea that you use guerrilla warfare. They also call it protracted People's War. So the Chinese Revolution, the Chinese Civil War lasted for decades. So this potentially very long-term guerrilla warfare where you base yourself mainly in the rural areas, what Mao did in China, what the New People's Army does in the Philippines, what the CPI Maoist does in India, what the Maoists in Nepal did. So they based themselves in the countryside, in the rural areas, and they used guerrilla warfare, and they set up these liberated areas, red base areas. So they take over villages, and they take over places, and they set up red base areas. And in these red base areas, they implement certain socialist policies. They get rid of the landlords, they implement land reform, and they provide healthcare, education, they do all this stuff. Mao called this serving the people. He had this slogan, serve the people. Black Panthers famously used the same slogan, serve the people. So provide healthcare, provide all these things that the people need. So it is a military strategy, but it's also kind of a political thing because you develop this miniature proto-socialist society already in these areas, in these liberated areas. And then the classical notion is that these countryside red areas, they eventually surround the cities, and then they take over the cities as well, and then you take over the entire country. So that's the military part of it. That's People's War. Now, what is my problem with People's War? Clearly, People's War works, to a degree at least, because in China it was successful. In Vietnam, similar strategies were used, and they were successful. It has had success in Nepal, Philippines, India. It had quite a lot of success in Peru. All of these revolutions are still ongoing. The Peruvian revolution, they faced a massive setback, but they still survive. The same tactic has been used somewhat successfully in Turkey by a number of groups, and in a lot of other countries. There's a lot of Maoist revolutions going on, a lot of Maoist guerrilla movements going on. You have to admit that the strategy of People's War is very influential, and it has many times been used successfully. However, I am skeptical when certain Maoists, they say that People's War is like the highest development of military strategy, or the next stage of military strategy, or communist revolution strategy. Like, I am unconvinced, because sometimes it's worked, but not all the time. Like, a lot of these revolutions, they're still ongoing. It's very difficult to defeat a guerrilla movement that uses People's War, but the New People's Army has been doing this for decades. The Maoists in India, they've been doing this for decades, and it's going like, sometimes they had success, sometimes they were defeated or pushed back a little bit, but they kept going, and it's still like, they control lots of territory, they got lots of fighters and all that, but it's still ongoing, and it's still, we shall see if they succeed. And a lot of times Maoists, they will say that, well, there hasn't been many successful European revolutions, so clearly People's War is more successful. I think that's correlation, not causation. Usually I ask Maoists, is People's War universally applicable? And some of them say, no, it's not. To which I will say, well, if it's only applicable in these third world countries, then it's irrelevant for me, because I live in the West. My view is that in these third world countries, like India, it makes perfect sense to use People's War. Take a country like Greece, or Ukraine, or Russia, or any of these countries where, if there was a big economic collapse, you could imagine a revolutionary situation happening. Just for the sake of argument, assume that there's a revolutionary situation in Greece. Greece has a big Marxist-Leninist Communist Party. They're already in a pretty bad situation, so another big collapse and Greece might have a revolution. So, in that case, I would say they should use a more conventional strategy instead of People's War. A conventional strategy, which is, you get the party decides we're gonna do a revolution, you get a bunch of people, and then you go and you occupy all the media, power stations, and government buildings, and military barracks, and you occupy those. You occupy the parliament building, you say, alright, it's revolution time. We declare that the workers are now in control. No need to go hiding in the bushes and hiding in the forest if you have power in the big cities, take over the big cities and do that. When it comes to, they will say that, well, the German Revolution failed, and the Hungarian Revolution failed, and the Finnish Revolution failed, the Russian Revolution was the only one that was successful. Well, I mean, to be honest, you could say that the Albanian Revolution succeeded, and whatever. There's European revolutions like this, but although that was a guerrilla movement in itself, but still, I feel like the reason why the Hungarian Revolution and the Finnish Revolution and the German Revolution, why they failed, was not because they didn't use People's War. They had a bunch of other problems. I don't think they would have fared any better with People's War. They had all kinds of other problems that led to their failure. So I don't think that People's War is just such a good idea, necessarily, in all circumstances. The next is New Democracy. New Democracy is this idea, it's sort of like the new economic policy that Lenin had. Basically, after the revolution happens, China, particularly, was a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country. And the new democratic state was supposed to basically do the bourgeois democratic revolution, so an anti-imperialist revolution and an anti-feudal revolution, with the participation of the peasantry, progressive petty bourgeoisie, and the patriotic forces, led by the working class and the communists. So it's like a united front against feudalism and against imperialism. And it is meant to facilitate a transition towards socialism. So it's basically tries to skip the capitalist phase, kinda. The new democratic state is a capitalist state in the same way that NEP was capitalism. See what I mean? So, it is a worker state. They did not want to just overthrow the feudal lords and overthrow the imperialists and then have capitalism. They said, no, we will now have a new democratic worker state, which then transitions towards socialism. Just like the Bolsheviks said, we will overthrow the feudal relations and we will, get rid of the white guards and stuff, but we won't give power back to the bourgeoisie. We will have a worker state, which then transitions towards socialism. So it's basically that, but it's tailored to third world, neo-colonial, semi-feudal, semi-colonial circumstances. And now, once again, the immediate question is, well, is this universally applicable? Well, no, it's not. It's only applicable to neo-colonial countries. So it's irrelevant for the West. And I will reiterate, in my view, Maoism is Marxism-leninism that is applied to these third world conditions. That is my view. You don't need almost any of these Maoist ideas in Western countries. Even Eastern European countries or any of these, like, industrial countries or relatively industrial countries. Mass line, that's like a big thing that you go, you speak to the people, you learn what the people need and what the people want, what is the political level of the people at this time. You take that information, you formulate that into a political line, you then declare this political line, you put forward this political line and your slogans and stuff, and then the people will hopefully follow you. If you have correctly estimated what the people want and what the political level of the people is and all that, then you hopefully, if you do this correctly, you can put forward a political line that the people will follow. And this is called mass line. To use a dialectical expression, it's from the people to the party, from the party to the people. And they call this the mass line. However, this is not really anything new. This is just good old vanguardism. Mao just came up with a good term for it. Mass line. From the masses to the masses. But this is exactly what vanguardism is all about. This is exactly what vanguardism has always been about. When the Bolsheviks had good connections and good ties to the working class and the masses in general, they realized what the people wanted, and they then formulated their political slogans and their political line to suit those needs, to suit the political level of the people at that current moment, and they were so successful at it that they came to power. And that is how they put forward the slogans, peace, bread, and land. That is mass line. So I don't think Maoism can claim to have invented the mass line. They haven't. But it is a useful concept. It is a useful way of thinking about this. In this sense, Mao only popularized an idea that was already in existence, but Mao didn't invent this idea. Then there is the Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution basically can mean two different things. In one sense, it means getting rid of old reactionary culture and replacing it or synthesizing it with progressive proletarian culture. You know, they took the traditional Chinese art forms, ballet, opera, calligraphy, everything, like traditional Chinese music and Chinese classical music and stuff, and they gave it a progressive proletarian content. They used progressive elements from their history and combined that with the progressive character of their current thing, and they, stuff like that. Cultural Revolution. Getting rid of horrible feudal practices like foot binding and forced marriages and stuff like that. Getting rid of all that horrible culture. Horrible reactionary culture. That is nothing new, really, because all the socialist countries did that. The Soviet Union did that. All the other socialist countries did that. So when Maoists say that Cultural Revolution was like a specifically Maoist thing and it's like the greatest thing ever, nah, not really. Very similar to what the other countries did. However, in the second sense of the term, Cultural Revolution, to me, what is the true significance of the Cultural Revolution? And I've said this before, it can be summed up in Mao's slogan, it is always right to rebel against reactionaries. I think that is a true development. And it might sound a bit stupid, like how is that such a big development? I'm not sure if it is a true new development or if it's a return to something previously existing, but one thing is for sure, it is an improvement over Stalin. Because in Stalin's conception, such a thing probably wouldn't have happened. Because in Stalin's view, and generally probably in Lenin's practical view as well, if there was some group that was an opposition group that went against the worker state, that would be considered a breach of democratic centralism, of course, and a breach of party unity, of course, naturally. But more than anything, it would be considered wrecking. So when Trotsky and his buddies had their clandestine organization to try to fight against the Soviet government, that was considered wrecking. They were called enemies of the people, and they were considered horrible traitors and criminals, as they should. Because objectively speaking, they were serving capitalist interests when they were doing that. However, if the party had been reactionary, like the party in Khrushchev's time became reactionary, and in China, when Deng Xiaoping's group were in leadership in the late 50s, when they were in the leadership, the party became reactionary. It started going on a very right-wing path. And at that point, when the people were criticizing the party, Mao encouraged this criticism. And they finally adopted the slogan of bombard the headquarters, bombard the capitalist headquarters, which meant that the party itself has this capitalist clique in it. And this is not to be understood literally. They were not literal capitalists, but they were leading a political line which would have led to the restoration of capitalism. And this is a very useful concept, the idea that there's a proletarian political line and a capitalist political line that compete inside the Communist Party itself and compete inside socialism itself. The right-wing revisionist line was leading back to capitalist restoration, and the revolutionary Marxist line, represented by Mao, was leading towards communism. So Mao said it is always right to rebel against reactionaries, even if they are in the Communist Party leadership. If they are reactionary, it is right to rebel against them, and it is necessary to rebel against them. And they did. And they actually ousted the Deng Xiaoping, Liu Shaoqi capitalist rotor clique. They ousted them. Now, of course, later, when Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came back to power, and, you had capitalist restoration. But the one time it was prevented. Now, this presents a difficult question. The people who are in power, they will always say, well, we are right, and if you rebel against us, you are a wrecker. And the people who are not in power can always say, well, no, the leadership is reactionary, and it's right to rebel against them. Well, how do you know if the leadership is correct or if the leadership is reactionary? How do you know if you support the leadership or if you support the opposition? Well, you don't. You gotta use your own brain. That's the unfortunate truth of the matter. You gotta use your own brain and think about this. And stakes are high. So if you do factional activity, then chances are you might get kicked out of the party. And if you do what Trotsky did, which is try to overthrow the government, then that is a crime. That is treason. The legal term for that is treason. That is not a moral statement. That is a legal statement. Legally speaking, that is treason. Now, what is the difference between treason and revolution? If you try to overthrow the government in a revolution, if you fail, you will probably be killed as a traitor. But if you win, then you'll probably be, you'll go down in history as a revolutionary. It pretty much just matters who wins. That settles it, really. This idea that the party itself can become reactionary and you should look out for that, and if the party becomes reactionary, then you should be prepared to overthrow it. This was something that Stalin never really seriously considered. It is a fact. He never considered this as a serious possibility. Stalin had a concept called the final victory of socialism. The final victory of socialism means a guarantee against capitalist restoration, a situation where capitalism no longer can be restored. And how Stalin defined this was that there's many socialist countries, there is effectively a guarantee against foreign intervention, foreign invasion. He thought that if most of the world is socialist and there's like 1 or 2 weak capitalist countries left, then they practically cannot win a war. They practically cannot militarily crush socialism anymore. He always thought that the external danger was the real danger, not the internal danger wasn't the real danger. And even so, like, what Stalin considered to be the internal danger, to be the internal class enemy, was kulaks and people like that, not revisionists. So Stalin thought that capitalism could be restored if the United States attacks, and then the internal, like, Nazi sympathizers and kulaks and whatnot, if they help to overthrow socialism. He thought this already after the foreign interventionist civil war, and this view was only strengthened in his mind by the Nazi invasion. So in that sense, Mao developed something. I don't know if it's because of Mao or if they came to this conclusion independently, but most Marxist-Leninist parties have adopted a similar idea. They all say the same things that Mao said. Class struggle will still continue, and this is the thing. Mao said this, that it's always right to rebel against reactionaries, but before he rebelled against the Chinese reactionaries, he was saying this about Khrushchev, as a response to Khrushchev. He didn't get this idea out of nowhere, he got this idea because of a specific thing. Because Khrushchev was saying that the dictatorship of the proletariat is no longer needed, because the Soviet Union is now in a stage of quote-unquote developed socialism, which is allegedly close to communism, where there's no class differences, no class antagonism, no class struggle, and stuff like that. And Mao said, no, there is class struggle, there is class antagonism. You still have a lot of ex-capitalists who are living. You still have a lot of people with right-wing political ideas. There is clearly a struggle between political lines going on, and Khrushchev himself represents the right-wing revisionist political line, struggling against the Marxist-Leninist line. Nowadays, most Marxist-Leninist parties, they say the exact same thing, that yeah, Khrushchev was wrong when he said that the dictatorship of the proletariat is no longer needed. He was absolutely incorrect, and he was a revisionist. And they also criticized the Soviet policy of peaceful coexistence with imperialism, just like Mao did, and just like Che Guevara did. To me, that is the most important contribution of Mao, but still, you don't have to be a Maoist to see that. Mao had a fancier way of saying this. He used a classic example of how the base creates the superstructure. The base is the economics, the economic relations, and all that. So the economic base, let's say capitalism, creates the superstructure. It's the governing, the ruling ideology, form of government, the organs of power, all that. So the capitalist economy creates a capitalist ideology, creates a capitalist government structure, stuff like that. And the socialist economic system creates a socialist ideology, socialist government structure. However, it is dialectical. So while the base is what creates the superstructure, the old superstructure remains to an extent. So you have capitalists, you take away their property, they stop being capitalists, but now they are ex-capitalists. And they still have their capitalist mentality to at least to some degree. So just because you change the economy, it doesn't mean that the old ideology goes away immediately. It will only go away gradually. Some parts of it will survive longer. And then Mao also said that you will have these economic relations in socialism which are imperfect, and they still have a lot of capitalist remnants in them, which will themselves recreate capitalistic ideas and individualistic ideas and stuff like that. Khrushchev being an example of that. That was kind of one of the reasons why they said that they specifically needed a cultural revolution, is because they need to combat not only capitalist economy, but also capitalist ideas. And that's why Mao said we need to put politics in command. And this is another interesting thing. Mao, when he criticized Stalin's book, Economic Problems of Socialism in the Soviet Union. Now, I think Stalin's book is actually very good. However, Mao said that Stalin has a too mechanistic idea. I don't remember if it was Mao who used this phrase, but there's this notion of a theory of productive forces. Mechanistic, vulgar Marxist idea. If you just have enough productive forces, then you'll automatically be moving forward. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, I mean, this was clearly visible in Stalin's USSR. This idea that if we increase industry, if we increase electricity, if we increase production, if we build this and we build that, then we are all the time moving closer and closer to communism. To a certain extent that makes sense, because you need a high level of productivity and a high level of technology for communism to be possible, but Mao correctly pointed out that economics is not everything. You also need the ideology. So just because you produce, and you develop the tech and you develop the production, that alone is not enough. And the Soviet Union, even under Stalin, they always had this idea that if we produce this much, and if we reach this production goal, then we will reach communism. That is a simplistic way of looking at it. And Maoists have, ever since, they have stressed that they oppose the theory of productive forces. That they need to put politics in command. That it's politics and ideology, and not only the economics. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need economics. I think some people go too far. They say that, economy doesn't matter. No, it matters very much, but ideology also matters. One of the reasons why Maoists stress this so much nowadays is because after Mao died, when Deng Xiaoping and then his buddies came to power, they have put forward an even more extreme version of the theory of productive forces. They make a total fetish out of the economy. They say, like, we have so much growth, we have so much economic growth. But look at China. What has their economic growth gotten them? Capitalism. They're not any more communist than they were before. In fact, they're much less communist. Their striving for more economic growth is basically being an excuse for privatization and restoration of capitalism. So I've spoken for a very long time, but I hope this clears up most of the things. here's where I stand. I have no problem with Maoism, in a sense. I have no problem with Maoists. I have no problem with Maoism in itself. I'm much more critical of Hoxhaism than I am of Maoism, but I don't think that Maoism is necessary. I think it's extremely useful to read Mao, and I think it's extremely useful to know these things, but I don't think that Maoism in itself is necessary, and it's not universally applicable. All these Maoist strategies, New Democracy, People's War, they make perfect sense in certain context, but I think it's an application of Marxism-Leninism rather than a, objective development of it. Just because you had a guy, Mao, who developed some theory, or applied a bunch of theory, just because you have that doesn't mean that he needs a new ism. We don't have Che Guevara-ism, Gramsci-ism, we don't have Fanon-ism, we don't have Black Panther-ism, even though they all, contributed a certain thing. We do have Hoxhaism, but the term in itself is kind of stupid. In practical terms, this means that, should India have a Maoist party? Well, yes, absolutely. Should they do what they're doing? Absolutely. Well, should the Philippines have a Maoist party? Absolutely. Should Turkey have a Maoist party? Should they be doing what they're doing? Absolutely. But the worst thing that can happen, in my opinion, is that you have a country, let's say in Russia, for example, you have the Russian Communist Workers' Party, which is a Marxist-Leninist party, and then you have a bunch of Maoists in Russia who say that Marxism-Leninism simply isn't good enough. We need Maoism. So we will split, and we will create a separate party. That is horrible. Same thing in Greece. You have a perfectly good, big Marxist-Leninist party, and then you have some Maoists who say, no. Marxism-Leninism is outdated, it's not good enough, you need Marxism-Leninism, Maoism, highest stage of the scientific communism, blah, 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 blah. We need to split, and we need to create a separate organization. That is only sectarianism, and it's stupid. Basically, I don't want there to be this split between Maoists and Marxist-Leninists. There's no need to have this split. If there is a tactical question, say that the Maoist group says we can't take part in any elections, and then the Marxist-Leninist group says we should take part in some elections, like let's say local elections or whatnot, to propagate our views and get our views out there. And now that is a tactical disagreement. I don't think you necessarily need to split over a tactical disagreement. You can just vote and decide. Hopefully don't need to split over something like that. And especially, the most stupid thing is when these groups, they split over the fact, do we have Marxism-Leninism, Maoism in our name instead of just Marxism-Leninism? Or do we have Mao's face on our posters? Or do we just have Marx and Lenin? That is so stupid. That is so childish. I hate that. That doesn't matter. And especially these ultra-left views put forward by Western Maoists who say, we need to, don't take part in any elections, don't take part in the trade union movement, don't do any of this, just go into the forest and do People's War. You are a child. You have got to be kidding me. When you say, it's People's War or nothing, then that just means it's nothing, because you're not gonna do it. You're never gonna do it, and even if you wanted to, you couldn't. So it's pointless. And then there's a question, I think that People's War is just not a good revolutionary strategy in these circumstances. So, I support a lot of Mao's ideas, but why don't I call myself a Maoist? Well, because I don't think it's universally applicable, because I don't think that it's a big enough development. I don't think it's a qualitative development, at least not in a big way, and because I think it creates an unnecessary split and an unnecessary division. We got Marxism-Leninism already. And now, the final counter-argument, and I feel like this is the big counter-argument that a lot of Maoists have. They say, well, Maoism is not just Mao Zedong thought, it's not just these things, People's War, New Democracy, Mass Line, Cultural Revolution. It's more than that. It is a qualitative leap. It is a continuity rupture. This is a term they love. They love the term continuity rupture. That it is not merely adding a bunch of things on top of Marxism-Leninism. It is a whole new thing. It severs the continuity from these old things and makes a new break towards something infinitely better. And they say that, but I don't buy it. I just don't buy it. This has never been demonstrated to me. They just use those words, but they never exactly explain how that happens. And I just don't buy it. At least, when I say, what did Mao do that was better? Well, I told you about combating revisionism, how it's always right to rebel against reactionaries, how it's right to go against the theory of productive forces. That is an objective improvement over previous application of Marxism-Leninism into practice. when Stalin defines how is Leninism an improvement over orthodox Marxism, he has examples, he has concrete examples. Lenin was building a worker state. Lenin was doing revolution. Lenin was building a worker state. He wrote about those things. He developed theory of revolution, theory of dictatorship of the proletariat, and he had an analysis of modern imperialism which didn't exist in the time of Marx. But Maoists, they never give any concrete examples, just continuity rupture and, like, I'm sure this will cause a heated discussion and some level of outrage, but I assure you, comrades, that I'm not trying to offend anybody. This is just my view. I think my view is justified. Oh, before I go, interesting thing. I met a Chinese guy, Chinese comrade, from the Chinese opposition and whatnot, and I asked him his view on Maoism, and I asked him specifically if he thinks that Maoism is a qualitative continuity rupture and a development over Marxism-Leninism, or if it's just an application of Marxism-Leninism. And I don't speak Chinese, and his English wasn't too good, so he spoke Russian. I had a Russian guy translate, so it's possible that something was lost in translation, but he seemed to agree with me. He seemed to say, no, yeah, Maoism is just application of Marxism-Leninism. He said that there's some people who are religious over Mao and say that Mao was infallible and Marxism-Leninism, Maoism in command and shit. But he at least seemed to have a very reasonable and rational idea, and he actually said that because China is so different now, that he doesn't think that the Chinese underground communist movement would necessarily even use People's War, because China is now much more an industrialized country. And that was interesting. He wasn't in any way anti-Mao or anything, of course not. Clearly he was very pro-Mao, but he seemed to agree with me that there's no need to split over whether you are Marxist-Leninist or if you have Marxist-Leninist Maoist in your name.